Hello, and welcome back to Eurospy Cinema, a series where I review various movies that fit into the Eurospy category. Today I'm going to be reviewing 1968's A Dandy in Aspic, a British Cold War thriller with touches of neo-noir. The film stars Laurence Harvey as Eberlin and Tom Courtenay as Gatiss, and was Anthony Mann's final production. It was based upon the book of the same name by Derek Marlowe, who also wrote the film's screenplay. Interestingly, Peter Cook also shows up as a minor character called Prentice. I don't normally do this, but here is a small warning that this review and the following plot summary are going to contain spoilers for a movie that was made almost 54 years ago. The film is actually pretty good and contains plenty of twists and turns, so if you don't want those spoiled for you, then it's probably best you click off this video and attempt to track down where to watch this film. I think it's on Apple TV right now, so you may want to try that. Anyway, on with the plot summary. The film begins with probably one of the most jarring and disturbing title sequences I have ever seen. In reality, this should not be a concerning title sequence, but in conjunction with Quincy Jones's marvellously offbeat and discordant theme, the whole sequence takes on qualities of some kind of strange fever dream. The music gets more and more intense as this poor, faceless marionette gets more and more tangled up in its strings by exterior forces. Following this, we open on a shot of a funeral at a church. An important-looking man with a cigar is watching the funeral proceedings and then answers a phone call in his Rolls Royce. The men carrying the coffin ask each other why they have to be so secret about the burial, and one responds that it's because they're burying Nightingale. This man here, Eberlin, then has a flashback to Nightingale's murder, and following that, goes out for dinner while this man wearing spectacles sits in his car outside. The man with glasses tries to talk to Eberlin, but Eberlin races off with the girl he met in the club. It turns out that the girl is a photographer called Caroline, and she tries to take Eberlin's picture, but he bluntly refuses. She then explains that it doesn't matter as she already has one. Eberlin seems perturbed by this, and after a short conversation, he puts on his coat, takes the photo she had, and leaves. As he walks away, he drops the photo down the drain. Spectacle Man meets up with Eberlin now and tells him that they must meet up with a guy called Fraser. We also discover here that Eberlin can speak Russian. The spectacle guy, whose name is Copperfield, explains how the Russians have tried to infiltrate the Secret Service of recent, and that Eberlin is soon to witness one of their failures. We then cut to two men looking at each other from a distance. Both of them are enemy agents, and the Secret Service men attempt to apprehend one of them, only for him to escape and be killed. We then cut to Eberlin arriving at the Secret Service HQ. He meets Brogue, his boss, who is practicing at the firing range. Their relationship seems more than strained. Brogue wants him to attend a meeting on Monday. Eberlin doesn't want to go, but he's ordered to. We also discover that Eberlin is a desk man who just organises stuff and doesn't carry the missions out. We also meet another new character here, Gatiss, who was hiding around the corner in the firing range and was keeping score of Brogue's shots. After Eberlin has gone, Brogue discusses with Gatiss how Eberlin wanted to kill Gatiss, but this doesn't seem to faze him at all. Gatiss also carries a shooting stick around with him everywhere. Eberlin then meets up with the other enemy agent who escaped earlier, explaining to him how he wants to go back to Russia. We realise here that Eberlin is indeed a double agent, and he thinks he's in too deep and wants out. He has realised that this was never the life he wanted, so it's imperative that he return to Moscow. His friend tells him that apparently tomorrow morning at the church he will be told whether he can return. In his parting words, Eberlin tells his friend that he would happily give his whole life away just for a true identity. We then see Eberlin the next day at the church. Inside a book he finds the answer. No. Eberlin then goes to a well-guarded house for the meeting which Brogue sent him to attend. The men in the meeting explain to Eberlin that Gatiss is going to be the next target of a string of assassinations that have happened. They want Eberlin to find and eliminate the assassin of these men, a man called Krasnavin. It becomes apparent to the audience that Eberlin and Krasnavin are one and the same, placing Eberlin in a strange situation of being tasked with hunting himself. The film builds tension really well here, accentuating noise and featuring quite moody lighting and lots of close-ups. Eberlin keeps his cool though. Nobody who is present, including Gatiss, seems to realise Eberlin's true identity. Eberlin then accepts the mission and is shown a film of who the British think that Krasnavin is. And it turns out that the man who they believe to be Krasnavin is actually Eberlin's Russian contact from earlier. Following this, Eberlin heads off to talk with his contact, Pavel. Pavel catches him snooping in his home and takes his gun. Eberlin then discovers that Pavel is killing himself with poison. Pavel begs Eberlin to shoot him and put him out of his misery, as the British already think that he is Krasnavin. Eberlin refuses to and runs outside, but for some reason he runs back to finish the job, only to watch as Pavel is dragged off by some agents. Eberlin then leaves for Berlin on his assignment. When he arrives, he doesn't take the Mercedes he was instructed to take, and instead gets a taxi to a train leaving for East Berlin. While at the station, he is spotted by Caroline, the photographer from earlier, which sets him off balance slightly. While being introduced to Caroline's friend, Eberlin is taken to see a man who seems to be heading up the border guard. Eberlin is refused entry to East Berlin, much to his chagrin, but he attempts to run for it anyway and fails. When Eberlin asks again why he was refused entry, the head guy hints that he knows that Eberlin is not who he appears to be. Eberlin then meets up with Caroline again, and they head on back to West Berlin. Meanwhile, this guy has been following Eberlin from the airport, and Eberlin keeps avoiding him. Eberlin becomes suspicious of Caroline as he feels that she has been following him. Eberlin attempts to call his Russian superiors, but is interrupted by Gatiss and his fellow agent Prentiss. Following this guy knocks on Eberlin's door, saying he wants to talk to him. So the two meet in the bathroom. The man does a poor job of trying to convince Eberlin that he too is working for the Secret Service, and tries to discover what Eberlin's plans are. Eberlin then pokes holes in the man's story during a short fight, and we realise that this man indeed works for the Russians, and Eberlin blames them for the mess he's in. When Eberlin returns to his room, he finds Gatiss, and Eberlin is sent to meet with Prentiss. But along the way, he is contacted by another Russian agent, who tells him not to worry, they have it sorted out and someone will be framed as Krasnavin. Eberlin then meets with Prentiss, who tells Eberlin that the CIA have said that Krasnavin is actually a double agent in the Secret Service, but that it isn't completely confirmed yet. Eberlin is then given a car and told to go back to Gatiss. But Eberlin doesn't return to the hotel, instead goes to a man who says he can smuggle Eberlin across the border. But Gatiss sees Eberlin contact him and calls the police, who raid the place. Gatiss is even more angry with Eberlin now for attempting such a foolhardy plan. It becomes apparent, however, that he still doesn't realise that Eberlin is actually Krasnavin. Eberlin then spends another night with Caroline, but Gatiss then interrupts them to give Eberlin a photograph of the guy from earlier, asking Eberlin if he knows him, and we find out that his name is Henderson. Gatiss then takes Eberlin to Henderson's home and they wait for him to arrive. When he eventually arrives, Eberlin is able to successfully shoot him before Gatiss is able to extract any information out of him. While escaping, Gatiss and Eberlin run into a couple of other Russians who aren't very happy that their comrade was killed. Also, I love this exchange here between Gatiss and his Russian counterpart Sobakovich.
Who do you think you are, Al Capone?
Who's Al Capone?
He was a megalomaniac gangster who murdered anyone who got in his way.
Really? Whatever happened to him?
He changed his name to Stalin and moved to Russia.
I thought he sounded familiar.
Gatiss and Sobakovich have a short conversation that amounts to Gatiss wanting Krasnavin and Sobakovich wanting £100,000 payment first. And there is another classic line here.
The killer wolf who leaves his guard soon becomes the prey. An old Russian proverb I made up this morning.
Any interactions between these two characters causes some great dialogue. Anyway, Gatiss agrees to the payment, and they arrange a place and time for the exchange. So we cut to the meeting. Gatiss and Sobakovich once again exchange some witty dialogue, and Gatiss is told that to find the information on Krasnavin, he needs to go to the basement of a certain department store at 3 AM. We then see Eberlin and Gatiss at the racetrack, where Gatiss finalizes something with one of the drivers, and the duo once again explain how much they hate each other. Eberlin then spends more time with Caroline the photographer. They take a ferry, and aboard it he confesses that he was once married to a woman whom he didn't love. The next thing, we're at the basement Sobakovich mentioned, where Gatiss and Eberlin meet up to investigate. When there, Gatiss and Eberlin find information that says that Copperfield is the assassin Krasnavin, and they find Copperfield's body inside a photo booth. In case you've forgotten, as there are many characters in this film, Copperfield is this mustachioed spectacled man from the beginning. In Copperfield's clothes, Gatiss and Eberlin find a list of operations and Russian papers, which convinces Gatiss that Copperfield was indeed the double agent. Gatiss then confesses to Eberlin that he thought that Eberlin was the double agent the whole time. They then head back onto the races. They see Caroline there, and Gatiss reminds Eberlin that he had better say goodbye to her now, as after today it may be dangerous for him to keep seeing her. Sobakovich then shows up and secretly slips Eberlin his number by means of a paper cup. Gatiss and Sobakovich then go off to watch the race, while Eberlin breaks the bad news to Caroline. It turns out that the preparations Gatiss made earlier were for one driver to force another off the track and into a crash. This causes the whole crowd to rush forward towards the scene of the accident, and while Sobakovich is distracted, Gatiss shoots him with a gun hidden in his shooting stick. Eberlin says his last goodbye to Caroline, and he then meets up with Prentiss, and they go to an airbase for a fast getaway back to England. At the airbase, Eberlin calls the number Sobakovich gave him and reports in. He discovers then that his friend Pavel from the beginning was not actually hauled away by the Russians, but it was in fact the British. This brings Eberlin to the realization that the English have known that he was the assassin the whole time, and that this was merely an elaborate charade on their part. He then hangs up and leaves to board the plane. On his way to embark, he asks Prentiss if he knew he was Krasnevin, and Prentiss, in his usual jolly mood, tells him that yeah, they knew the whole time, and then changes the subject. Just before he boards the plane, Ebelin sees a car on the edge of the airstrip, which flashes its lights at him. Ebelin, believing this must be his Russian colleagues here to save him, starts running towards it. But he stops when he sees that its driver is actually Gatiss. Instead of turning back towards the plane though, he puts on a determined expression and starts running towards the car as Gatiss begins to drive towards him. Ebelin then draws his gun and shoots Gatiss, just as he is hit by the car. And the credits roll, accompanied by another disturbing puppet sequence. And that was A Dandy and Aspic. The film's name was confusing for me at first, as I had no idea what aspic was and why on earth a dandy would be trapped in it. But thankfully, Google Dictionary came to my aid, and after a quick search I found that aspic is disgusting. Apparently it's a type of savoury jelly made from animal stock with lumps of meat inside it. And of course a dandy is a man who's a little too concerned with dressing well. The name of the movie actually makes a lot of sense from this. That the dandy, Ebelin, is encased in this aspic-like web of intrigue, longing to escape, but never really reaching the surface. Despite the film not being particularly popular at the time and having a somewhat murky plot, I really quite like this. The film definitely starts to wane around the middle, but really picks up pace as it tears towards the terribly tragic end. This, amongst a few other pacing issues, can be put down to production difficulties that surrounded the film. During location shoots in Berlin, Anthony Mann had a heart attack and passed away, leaving Lawrence Harvey to direct the last 2 weeks of shooting. Anthony Mann left large shoes to fill, and all things considered, I feel that Harvey did a pretty good job, as the film holds together pretty well. The dreamlike sequences work well for the film, giving a sort of insight into the true terror that Ebelin feels towards being found out. I feel though that the film relies a little too heavily on the tension of Ebelin's potential exposure. It begins at the start of the film and only really builds from there, giving you no real break from the continuous threat that Ebelin is under. I think the film could have benefited from a slightly later reveal that Ebelin was Krasnevin, but as it sits now, I think it's still pretty good. Lawrence Harvey does a very nice job of playing Ebelin, a character who is nothing like the most popular spy of the time, James Bond. It's nice to have somebody playing a spy in the 60s who isn't trying to copy Sean Connery. Harvey may look suave and sophisticated, but we see that his character is a very troubled man. The bluntness and lack of excitement to his line delivery makes him seem cold, hard and ruthless, which neatly contrasts with the occasional moments where he opens up about his deep sadness and loneliness. Tom Courtenay is amazing as Gatiss. The character is super cynical and is a total sociopath, openly hating everyone he works with. The addition of a shooting stick that he carries around everywhere just adds that little bit of eccentricity to the character, which lifts him up from being just a disgruntled ally to a strange and slightly deranged man. Courtenay delivers his dialogue superbly and plays really well off Lionel Stander's Sobakovich. Sobakovich is, I believe, meant to be Gatiss's opposite number in Soviet intelligence, and Stander's performance works really well to portray this. Unlike Gatiss, he seems overly friendly, handing out cigars to enemy agents and generally being larger than life. His dialogue, much like Gatiss, is very well delivered, and he's so openly friendly that you cannot help but be suspicious of the guy. Mia Farrow is very nice as Caroline. Her character seems somewhat tacked onto the film, as a lot of her scenes are very disconnected from the Cold War espionage that is happening. But this does kind of work, showing the blissful unawareness of the rest of the world while such dangerous spy work is being carried out under their noses. Per Oscarsson's Pavel is not in the film too much, but really makes an impact. Oscarsson plays the character in such a tired way that he too wants to retire like Ebelin, but is already aware that he will never be allowed to. The character's exit from the film by being dragged off by the British agents is very fitting, that a man who has spent his whole life working with mystery and intrigue would not be allowed to simply die peacefully. Prentiss, on the other hand, is completely different. Played by comedian Peter Cook, he stands out much against the dark tone of the film. Cook plays him with only a very slight comedic flair, with the character mostly coming across as just being completely unaware of the true nature of spying. He simply seems oblivious to the dangerous nature of the situations that he finds himself in. The film is very well shot. The look of everything reflects the bleak nature of the work that Ebelin is involved in. Dutch angles are used very sparingly, but when they are, it's often to reflect Ebelin's fear or terror, which works pretty well, so that by the end of the film, we don't even need Ebelin to say anything for us to deduce that he is anxious. Quincy Jones scored the film amazingly. Its theme is so unsettling through the strange, discordant melody that he created, It features that sort of stereotypical Russian sound, which overall reflects perfectly how unbalanced Ebelin is and his Russian heritage. The writing is superb for the film. The twists and turns are really well written and executed, though I have to say, I think the ending could have been a little better. I find it a bit hard to believe that Gatiss would kill himself in the process of trying to get Ebelin. The dialogue is also great, especially between Zabakovich and Gatiss. Overall, A Dandy in Aspic is a pretty good watch. It doesn't quite reach the heights it was aiming for, but doesn't fall too short. Taking into consideration the sudden directorial change, it is very cohesive and maintains a similar theme throughout. There is little action, as the film mainly relies on its story elements, but that's fine with me, as the story is intriguing enough to keep me invested. All the actors are superb, but Ebelin, Gatiss, Zabakovich, and a minor role from Peter Cook are the real highlights. If you want to watch the film, I think it's available to rent on Apple TV in Australia, but streaming services change what they show so often that I'm unsure as to how long it'll stay like that. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode of Eurospy Cinema, so I'll see you later. Goodbye.